train's whistle cut through the Montana dawn like a blade through silk, its mournful cry echoing across the endless prairie as steam billowed into the crisp October air. Cheryl Anderson pressed her palm against the cool window glass, watching the small town of Cedar Ridge emerge from the morning mist like a mirage she wasn't certain she wanted to reach. Her other hand rested protectively over the gentle swell beneath her traveling dress, a secret that grew heavier with each mile that brought her closer to her destination. The letter crumpled in her reticule bore the careful script of Alexander Moore, a rancher who had answered her advertisement for correspondence with the earnest words of a man seeking companionship in the vast loneliness of the frontier. Their exchange of letters over 6 months had painted him as steady and kind, a widower who worked his land with honest hands and spoke of building a life together with quiet determination. What those letters had not contained was any mention of the child she now carried, the consequence of a night that had destroyed her reputation and driven her from everything she had ever known. Sheriff Edward Reyes stood on the platform, his weathered face scanning the emerging passengers with the practiced eye of a man accustomed to reading trouble before it announced itself. At 35, he had seen enough of life's complications to recognize them in the careful way a young woman gathered her skirts, in the protective curve of her shoulders, in the way her eyes searched the crowd with equal measures of hope and fear. When his gaze settled on the slight figure stepping down from the passenger car, something in his chest tightened with an inexplicable sense of foreboding. The morning sun cast long shadows across the wooden platform, and Cheryl felt exposed in its golden light as she searched the faces of the waiting men. She had memorized Alexander's description from his letters, tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair touched by silver at the temples. But the crowd seemed filled with strangers whose curious stares made her skin prickle with awareness. The weight of her condition pressed against her consciousness like a stone, and she wondered if somehow these people could see through the careful draping of her dress to the shame she carried beneath. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. A commotion near the freight car drew her attention, and she watched as two men argued over a shipment of supplies, their voices rising above the general murmur of the platform. The taller man wore a badge that caught the morning light, and something in his bearing suggested authority tempered by weariness. When he turned in her direction, their eyes met across the crowded platform, and for a moment the world seemed to pause in its turning. Edward felt the impact of that gaze like a physical blow, recognizing in her face the kind of desperation that came from having nowhere left to run. She was younger than he had expected, perhaps 22 or 23, with auburn hair that caught fire in the sunlight and green eyes that held depths of sorrow he instinctively wanted to ease. But it was the protective way she held herself, the subtle shift in her posture that spoke of secrets carefully guarded, that made him take an involuntary step forward. The moment shattered when a voice called out across the platform. "Miss Anderson? Miss Cheryl Anderson?" A man approached from the direction of the town, his gait confident, but his expression uncertain. Alexander Moore matched his written description perfectly, from his work-roughened hands to the kind eyes that had drawn her to respond to his letters. But seeing him in person, watching the way his gaze swept over her with careful assessment, Cheryl felt the full weight of her deception settle upon her shoulders like a lead cloak. "Mr. Moore." Her voice carried clearly in the morning air, and she was grateful it betrayed none of the trembling that had taken hold of her limbs. "I am Cheryl Anderson." Alexander's smile was warm but cautious as he approached, his hat held respectfully in his hands. "Miss Anderson, welcome to Cedar Ridge. I hope your journey wasn't too taxing." His eyes lingered on her with genuine pleasure, but she caught the way his gaze flickered briefly to her figure before returning to meet her eyes. The moment passed so quickly she might have imagined it, but the chill that ran down her spine suggested otherwise. "The journey was long but uneventful," she replied, accepting his offered arm with fingers that trembled only slightly. "Your letters spoke so fondly of this place that I found myself eager to see it for myself." As they walked toward his wagon, Cheryl became aware of the sheriff's continued presence at the edge of her vision. Edward Reyes had not moved from his position near the freight car, but his attention remained fixed on their small party with an intensity that made her increasingly uncomfortable. There was something in his dark eyes that suggested he saw more than others might, and she found herself hoping that whatever he thought he observed would remain his own counsel. The town of Cedar Ridge stretched before them like a promise written in weathered wood and dusty streets. False-fronted buildings lined the main thoroughfare, their painted signs advertising everything from dry goods to legal services, while boardwalks provided elevated passage above the rutted dirt road. It was smaller than the city she had fled, but there was something honest about its unpretentious architecture that appealed to her bruised spirit. Here, perhaps, she might find the fresh beginning she so desperately needed. Alexander helped her into the wagon with gentle courtesy, his hands steady and warm against her arms. "The ranch is about 5 miles out," he explained as he settled beside her and gathered the reins. "Not much to look at yet, but I've been working to improve it these past few years. Lost my first wife to fever 3 winters ago, and the place has felt empty ever since." The mention of his deceased wife sent a pang of guilt through Cheryl's chest. She had known from his letters that he was a widower, but hearing him speak of his loss with such quiet pain made her own deception feel all the more cruel. This man deserved honesty, deserved a woman who could come to him without secrets or shame, and instead he was receiving damaged goods wrapped in lies. As they drove through the town, Cheryl noticed how people paused in their activities to watch their passage. Some offered friendly waves to Alexander, their faces curious but welcoming as they observed his companion. Others, particularly a cluster of women gathered outside the general store, watched with expressions that seemed to catalog every detail of her appearance for later discussion. She had grown accustomed to such scrutiny in recent months, but it still made her want to shrink into herself and disappear. The sheriff's office occupied a prominent position on Main Street, its solid construction and barred windows speaking to the serious business conducted within its walls. As their wagon passed, Cheryl caught sight of Edward Reyes through the open doorway, his tall frame bent over a desk covered with papers. Something made him look up at that moment, and once again their eyes met across the distance. This time, however, his expression held a gravity that made her breath catch in her throat. "Edward's a good man," Alexander said, following her gaze. "Been sheriff here for about 8 years now. Came from back east somewhere, though he doesn't talk much about his past. Keeps the peace and asks few questions, which suits most folks just fine." He glanced at her with a slight smile. "Course, he's got a reputation for seeing things others might miss. Makes him good at his job, but it can make some people nervous." The comment sent another chill through Cheryl, and she forced herself to look away from the sheriff's office toward the safer view of the passing landscape. "He seems very observant," she managed, hoping her voice sounded casual rather than concerned. "That he is," Alexander agreed, "but fair, too. Never known him to judge a person harshly without cause." He guided the horses around a particularly deep rut in the road. "Speaking of which, I hope you won't mind if folks are a bit curious about you for a while. New faces are rare enough in Cedar Ridge that they tend to generate considerable interest." Cheryl nodded, though the thought of being the subject of town gossip made her stomach clench with anxiety. "I understand. I suppose it's natural for people to be curious about strangers." "They'll warm to you quickly enough," Alexander assured her, "especially once they see what a fine woman I've chosen to court." The word court hung in the air between them, a reminder of the expectations that had brought her to this place. They had agreed through their correspondence to a period of getting acquainted before making any permanent commitments. But Cheryl knew that her condition would make such luxury impossible. The landscape opened up as they left the town behind, revealing rolling hills dotted with cattle and bounded by distant mountains that rose like purple sentinels against the sky. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of grass and sage. And despite her worries, Cheryl felt something in her chest loosen slightly. There was space here, room to breathe, and perhaps even room to heal from the wounds that had driven her so far from home. Alexander's ranch house came into view as they crested a low hill, and Cheryl felt her first stirring of genuine hope since boarding the train. It was a modest structure of logs and stone, but well-maintained and surrounded by evidence of careful husbandry. Outbuildings dotted the immediate area, and a small garden plot showed the remnants of a successful harvest. Smoke rose from the chimney, and golden light spilled from the windows, creating an impression of warmth and welcome that made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "It's beautiful," she said softly, and meant it. After months of uncertainty and fear, the sight of this peaceful homestead felt like a glimpse of the life she had dreamed might still be possible. Alexander's face brightened with pleasure at her words. I'm glad you think so. I know it's not much compared to what you might be used to in the city, but it's honest work and good land. A man can build something lasting here, something to pass on to his children. The mention of children sent another spike of anxiety through Hicker, but she managed to keep her expression neutral. A woman emerged from the house as they approached, wiping her hands on her apron and shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. She was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and the kind of weathered features that spoke of a life spent outdoors. Her expression was curious but not unfriendly as she watched their approach. That's Martha Robinson, Alexander explained. She's been helping me keep house since my wife passed. Good woman, though she's got opinions about most everything and isn't shy about sharing them. He chuckled softly. I expect she'll have plenty to say about you once she gets a good look. As if summoned by his words, Martha stepped forward to meet them as Alexander helped Cheryl down from the wagon. Her sharp eyes took in every detail of the newcomer's appearance with the thoroughness of a woman accustomed to making quick assessments of character and situation. So this is the young lady you have been corresponding with? Martha said, her tone neutral, but her gaze penetrating. Welcome to Cedar Ridge, Miss Anderson. I hope you'll find it to your liking. Thank you, Mrs. Robinson. Mr. Moore has spoken very highly of you in his letters. Cheryl managed what she hoped was a warm smile despite the woman's intimidating scrutiny. I'm grateful for your kindness in welcoming a stranger. Martha's expression softened slightly at the gracious response. Well, you've got manners, I'll give you that. Come inside and I'll fix you something to eat. You look like you could use a good meal and some rest after that long journey. The interior of the house was simple but comfortable, with sturdy furniture and touches that spoke of feminine influence in better times. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the scent of fresh bread filled the air. Cheryl felt some of the tension leave her shoulders as she took in the homey atmosphere, though she remained acutely aware of Martha's continued observation. I've prepared the spare room for you, Mom, Martha said, leading them toward a hallway that branched off from the main living area. Figured you'd want your privacy while you and Alexander get better acquainted. She paused at a doorway and pushed it open to reveal a small but clean bedroom, furnished with a simple bed, dresser, and washstand. It's not fancy, but it's comfortable enough. It's perfect, Cheryl said, meaning it. After the cramped quarters of her boarding house in Chicago and the uncertainty of her recent travels, the quiet room felt like a sanctuary. Thank you for taking such trouble on my behalf. Martha nodded briskly. No trouble at all. Now let me get you settled, and then we'll see about that meal. Alexander, you can bring in her trunk whenever you're ready. As Alexander went to retrieve her belongings from the wagon, Martha lingered in the doorway, her expression thoughtful. Might I ask what brought you all the way out here, Miss Anderson? It's a long journey for a young woman to make alone, especially to meet a man she's never seen in person. The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Cheryl felt her carefully constructed composure begin to crack under the woman's steady gaze. She had prepared answers for such inquiries, but something in Martha's manner suggested that simple explanations might not suffice. I had few ties remaining in Chicago, she said carefully. My parents passed some years ago, and I found myself alone with limited prospects. When I read Mr. Moore's advertisement, his letters convinced me that perhaps a fresh start might be beneficial for us both. Martha's eyes narrowed slightly, as if she sensed the gaps in that explanation. And you have no other family? No one who might worry about your welfare in traveling so far from home? No one who would object to my seeking happiness where I might find it, Cheryl replied, the words carrying more truth than she intended. Her aunt and uncle, who had taken her in after her parents' death, had made their feelings about her situation abundantly clear when they discovered her condition. Their parting words still echoed in her memory like a curse. Something in her tone must have conveyed the pain behind those words, because Martha's expression softened perceptibly. Well then, I suppose we'll just have to make sure you find what you're looking for here. She stepped back into the hallway. I'll leave you to freshen up. Supper will be ready in an hour. Alone at last, Cheryl sank onto the bed and allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. The weight of her deception pressed down upon her like a physical burden, and she found herself wondering how long she could maintain the pretense before the truth became impossible to hide. Alexander seemed like a genuinely good man, and the thought of betraying his trust made her stomach churn with guilt. But what choice did she have? The alternative was a return to the streets of Chicago and a fate too terrible to contemplate. She rose and moved to the small mirror above the washstand, studying her reflection with critical eyes. The journey had taken its toll, leaving her face pale and drawn with exhaustion, but the changes in her figure remained subtle enough that loose clothing could still conceal them. Perhaps she had more time than she feared, time to find a way to tell Alexander the truth without destroying the fragile hope that had brought her here. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and Alexander's voice called through the wood. "Miss Anderson, I brought your trunk. May I come in?" "Of course," she replied, stepping back as he entered with her battered leather trunk balanced on his shoulder. He set it down carefully beside the dresser, then straightened to face her with an expression of gentle concern. "I hope Martha didn't overwhelm you with questions," he said. "She means well, but she can be rather direct in her approach to new people." "She was perfectly kind," Cheryl assured him. "I understand her desire to look out for your welfare. It speaks well of the regard in which you are held." Alexander's smile was warm and genuine. "I'm glad you see it that way. Some folks might find her manner a bit intrusive." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I want you to know that I have no expectations beyond what we discussed in our letters. You're welcome to stay as long as you need to decide whether this arrangement might suit us both." His kindness only intensified her guilt, and she had to look away to hide the moisture that gathered in her eyes. "You're very generous, Mr. Moore. I hope I can prove worthy of your consideration." "Alexander," he corrected gently, "and I have no doubt that you will." He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. "I should mention that we'll be having visitors tomorrow evening. Charles Mitchell and his wife Betty are coming for dinner, along with the pastor and his wife. I thought it might be nice for you to meet some of the neighbors." The prospect of facing strangers while maintaining her deception sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her, but she managed to nod agreeably. "That sounds lovely. I look forward to meeting them." After he left, Cheryl unpacked her few belongings with mechanical precision, her mind racing with the implications of tomorrow's gathering. Each social interaction would be another test of her ability to maintain the fiction of her circumstances, another opportunity for someone to see through the careful facade she had constructed. The thought of sitting through an entire evening under the scrutiny of Alexander's friends made her hands shake as she hung her dresses in the small wardrobe. The sound of voices from the main room drew her attention, and she recognized Martha's distinctive tone, engaged in what sounded like an animated conversation with Alexander. Though she couldn't make out the words, something in the older woman's cadence suggested that Cheryl herself was the subject of discussion. She pressed her ear to the door, straining to catch fragments of the exchange. "Something about her that doesn't quite—" Martha's voice faded as she apparently moved away from the hallway. Alexander's deeper tones were equally indistinct, but his response carried a note of gentle reproof that suggested he was defending his guest against whatever concerns Martha might be expressing. The conversation continued for several more minutes before footsteps indicated that one of them had left the room. Cheryl stepped back from the door, her heart pounding with the fear of discovery. If Martha already suspected something amiss, how long would it be before her sharp eyes detected the truth that Cheryl was so desperately trying to conceal? The thought of being exposed before she had even had a chance to explain herself to Alexander filled her with a desperation that made her chest tight with panic. A gentle rap on her door made her jump, and Martha's voice called softly, "Miss Anderson? Supper's ready when you are." "I'll be right there," Cheryl replied, grateful that her voice sounded steadier than she felt. She smoothed her skirts and checked her reflection once more, then opened the door to find Martha waiting in the hallway with an expression that seemed both welcoming and watchful. The meal was simple but delicious, featuring fresh bread, roasted chicken, and vegetables from the garden. Alexander proved to be an engaging conversationalist, sharing stories of ranch life and the history of Cedar Ridge with genuine enthusiasm. Martha contributed her own observations about the town's residents, displaying a sharp wit that made Cheryl understand why Alexander valued her presence in his household. As the evening progressed, Cheryl began to relax slightly, finding herself genuinely enjoying the company and the sense of belonging that came with sharing a meal in this warm kitchen. For brief moments, she could almost forget the weight of her secrets and imagine that this might truly become her home. But then Martha would catch her eye with a particularly penetrating look, or Alexander would mention their planned future with such hopeful certainty, and the guilt would crash over her anew. I should mention that Sheriff Reyes might stop by tomorrow evening, Alexander said as Martha cleared the dishes. He often joins us when we have company, and I know he's curious to meet you properly. The mention of the sheriff sent a chill through Cheryl that she hoped didn't show on her face. Of course, I look forward to making his acquaintance. The lie tasted bitter on her tongue, but she forced herself to maintain a pleasant expression. Edward's got good instincts about people, Martha observed, her eyes fixed on Cheryl's face. Never known him to be wrong in his assessments. Should be interesting to see what he makes of our newest resident. The comment felt loaded with meaning, and Cheryl found herself wondering if Martha and the sheriff had already discussed her arrival. The thought of being the subject of speculation among the town's authorities made her appetite disappear entirely, though she forced herself to finish the food on her plate to avoid drawing attention. As the evening wound down, Alexander walked her to her room, pausing at the doorway with the same gentle courtesy he had shown throughout the day. I hope you'll sleep well, Cheryl. Tomorrow I'll show you around the ranch properly, if you'd like. It might help you get a better sense of what life here would be like. I'd enjoy that very much, she replied, touched by his thoughtfulness despite her growing anxiety about the future. Thank you for making me feel so welcome. It's my pleasure, he said simply. Good night. Alone in her room at last, Cheryl prepared for bed with movements that felt automatic and disconnected from her churning thoughts. The events of the day had left her emotionally exhausted, but her mind refused to quiet as she contemplated the challenges that lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring new tests of her ability to maintain her deception, and she was far from certain that she possessed the strength to see it through. She lay in the narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her and the distant call of night birds from the prairie beyond. In Chicago, she had grown accustomed to the constant noise of city life, but here the silence felt profound and somehow watchful. Every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified. Every whisper of wind against the windows carried potential menace. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of accusatory faces and pointing fingers, of secrets exposed and trust betrayed. She woke several times throughout the night, her heart racing from nightmares she couldn't quite remember. And each time it took longer to convince herself that she was safe in Alexander's house, rather than fleeing through dark streets with nowhere left to hide. The first light of dawn was filtering through her small window when the sound of horses approaching at speed jerked her fully awake. Voices called urgently from the yard, and she heard Alexander's door open as he responded to whatever emergency had brought visitors to his door so early. Cheryl rose and moved to the window, peering through the curtains to see two men on horseback speaking animatedly with Alexander, who had emerged from the house still pulling on his shirt. One of the riders she didn't recognize, but the other wore the distinctive badge of a deputy sheriff, and something in his agitated gestures suggested that serious trouble had come to Cedar Ridge in the night. As she watched, Alexander nodded grimly and disappeared back into the house, returning moments later fully dressed and carrying what appeared to be a rifle. The three men rode off toward town at a gallop, leaving behind only dust and the echo of hoofbeats to mark their passage. Cheryl remained at the window, her heart pounding with a fear she couldn't name, as Martha appeared in the yard to watch their departure with an expression of deep concern. Whatever crisis had called Alexander away so urgently, Cheryl couldn't shake the feeling that it somehow involved her. The timing felt too coincidental, coming so soon after her arrival, and the deputy's presence suggested that Sheriff Reyes was taking whatever had happened very seriously indeed. As she dressed hurriedly, her hands trembling with anxiety, she tried to prepare herself for the possibility that her carefully constructed new life was about to come crashing down around her. The sound of Martha's footsteps in the hallway was followed by a sharp knock on her door. "Miss Anderson, I'm afraid we may have trouble coming our way. You'd best come out here so we can discuss what needs to be done." Cheryl opened the door to find Martha's face grave with worry, her usual brisk manner replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "What's happened?" she asked, though she wasn't certain she wanted to hear the answer. Someone broke into the sheriff's office last night, Martha said without preamble. Went through his desk and files, made a real mess of the place. Edward thinks they might have been looking for something specific, something that arrived on yesterday's train. The words hit Cheryl like a physical blow, and she had to grip the door frame to keep from swaying. The train? But why would anyone think? That's what we need to figure out, Martha interrupted, her sharp eyes studying Cheryl's face with uncomfortable intensity. Because whoever did this knew exactly where to look, and they were willing to risk a lot to get their hands on whatever information Edward might have received. The question is, Miss Anderson, what exactly did you bring to Cedar Ridge that someone else wants badly enough to commit a crime to get it? The accusation hung in the air between them like a blade, and Cheryl felt the last of her carefully constructed defenses begin to crumble. In the distance, she could hear the sound of more riders approaching, and she knew with terrible certainty that her time had run out. Whatever secrets she had hoped to keep buried were about to be dragged into the harsh light of day, and she was powerless to stop the reckoning that was thundering toward them across the prairie dawn. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, and through the window, Cheryl could see a cloud of dust rising from the road that led to town. Martha's accusation still hung between them like a drawn blade, and the older woman's eyes never wavered from Cheryl's face as they waited for whatever revelation was thundering toward them across the morning prairie. I don't know what you're suggesting, Cheryl said, though her voice carried none of the conviction she desperately wished she could summon. I'm simply a woman seeking a new life. Nothing more. Martha's expression remained skeptical. Maybe so, but in my experience, when trouble follows someone this closely, it's usually because they're carrying something that belongs to someone else. The question is whether you've brought it knowingly or if you're just an unfortunate messenger. Before Cheryl could respond, the riders crested the hill and came into clear view. Sheriff Edward Reyes led the group, his face grim with purpose, followed by Alexander and two men she didn't recognize. Behind them rode another figure that made her blood turn to ice in her veins. Even at this distance, even after all these months, she recognized the cruel set of Raymond James's shoulders and the predatory way he sat his horse. Dear God, she whispered, her hand instinctively moving to protect the secret she carried. He found me. Martha's sharp intake of breath suggested she had caught both the words and their significance. Who found you, child? Who is that man? And what does he want with you? But Cheryl was already backing away from the window, her mind racing with the desperate need to flee. Raymond James had tracked her across half the continent, which meant he knew about the child and had come to claim what he believed was his property. The thought of facing him again, of being dragged back to the hell she had escaped, made her knees weak with terror. I have to go, she said, moving toward her trunk with jerky, panicked movements. I have to leave before he sees me. Martha caught her arm with surprising strength. Running won't solve anything, girl. If that man has business with you, he'll find you wherever you go. Better to face it here, where you've got people who might stand with you. The riders were close enough now that Cheryl could see Raymond's face clearly, and the cold satisfaction in his expression told her that her flight had come to an end. He had always enjoyed the hunt, had taken pleasure in cornering his prey before moving in for the kill. The months she had spent looking over her shoulder, jumping at shadows and sleeping with one ear open, had all led to this moment of inevitable confrontation. Edward Reyes dismounted first, his movements controlled but tense as he approached the house. Alexander followed, his confusion evident as he glanced between the sheriff and the stranger who had accompanied them. But it was Raymond who commanded Cheryl's attention as he swung down from his horse with the fluid grace of a predator, his pale eyes scanning the windows of the house with calculating intensity. Miss Anderson, Edward called, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. I need to speak with you. There's been some trouble in town, and I believe you might have information that could help us understand what happened. Cheryl's legs felt like water as she forced herself to move toward the door. There was no escape now, no way to avoid the reckoning that had been pursuing her across the miles. Martha fell into step beside her, and she was grateful for the older woman's steady presence, even as her world prepared to collapse around her. They emerged onto the porch together, and Cheryl felt Raymond's gaze fix on her like a physical weight. His smile was cold and triumphant, the expression of a man who had won a game whose rules only he understood. But it was Alexander's face that broke her heart, the confusion and growing concern in his kind eyes as he began to sense that the woman he had welcomed into his home was not who she claimed to be. "Well, well," Raymond said, his cultured voice carrying easily across the yard. "Cheryl Anderson, is it? How creative of you, darling. Though I have to say the name suits you better than some of the others you've used." Alexander stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle he still carried. "I don't know who you are, mister, but you'll speak respectfully to Miss Anderson or not at all." Raymond's laugh was like broken glass. "Miss Anderson? Oh, my dear fellow, I'm afraid you've been sadly deceived. Allow me to introduce myself, Raymond James of the Chicago James family. And this lovely creature is my wife, though she seems to have forgotten that particular detail in her eagerness to start fresh." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow, and Cheryl watched the color drain from his face as the implication sank in. "Wife?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "Oh yes," Raymond continued, clearly enjoying the devastation he was causing. "Married these 6 months past, though she ran away before we could properly celebrate our union. Took something that belonged to me when she left too, though I expect she's been hoping I wouldn't notice." Edward Reyes had remained silent during this exchange, but now he stepped forward with the authority of his office. "Mr. James, you mentioned that Mrs. James took something when she left Chicago. Care to elaborate on what exactly you're accusing her of stealing?" Raymond's smile widened, and Cheryl felt her last hope crumble as he reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "Nothing so dramatic as theft, Sheriff. Simply a matter of a wife abandoning her husband and taking with her something that rightfully belongs to the James family name." "I was never your wife," Cheryl said, finding her voice at last, though it trembled with the force of her emotions. "What happened between us was not marriage. It was violence and coercion. I owe you nothing, and I'll return to Chicago with you over my dead body." Raymond's expression darkened at her defiance, and for a moment the civilized mask slipped to reveal the cruelty beneath. "Careful, darling. You're in no position to make threats. I have legal documents that say otherwise, and I'm sure the good sheriff here respects the law." Edward's hand moved to rest on his gun belt, a subtle but unmistakable gesture. "I respect justice, Mr. James, and I've seen enough forced marriages to know the difference between legal documents and actual consent. Why don't you show me these papers you're so proud of?" As Raymond unfolded the document, Cheryl caught sight of the official seals and formal language that had been used to bind her to a man she despised. The memory of that terrible night came flooding back. The way Raymond had cornered her in her employer's house when she was alone and vulnerable. The threats he had made against her remaining family if she didn't comply with his demands. "You see," Raymond said, holding the marriage certificate where everyone could see it, all perfectly legal and binding. "Cheryl Marie Anderson became Mrs. Raymond James on the 15th of April, witnessed and recorded according to Illinois law." Alexander's face had gone ashen as he stared at the document. "Cheryl, is this true? Are you married to this man?" The pain in his voice was like a knife in her chest, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. "The ceremony took place, yes, but it was not a marriage born of choice or love. It was extortion, plain and simple." "The law doesn't recognize such distinctions," Raymond said smoothly. "A wife belongs with her husband, regardless of her personal feelings on the matter, and I have every right to reclaim what is mine." Martha had remained silent throughout the exchange, but now she stepped forward with fire in her eyes. "What is it you think she took from you, you snake? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like she escaped from a situation that no decent woman should have to endure." Raymond's gaze shifted to Martha with cold calculation. "My wife is carrying my child, madam. Surely even in this God-forsaken wilderness, people understand that a man has rights regarding his own offspring." The revelation hit the assembled group like a thunderclap, and Cheryl watched as understanding dawned on Alexander's face. His eyes moved to her figure, noting details that had been hidden by careful clothing and positioning, and she saw the exact moment when he realized the truth of her condition. "A child," he said quietly, and the devastation in his voice made her want to weep. "You're with child, and you never told me." "I wanted to," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I planned to find the right moment, the right words. I never meant to deceive you about something so important. Raymond stepped closer, his confidence growing as he sensed victory within his grasp. You see how she operates, gentlemen? Lies and deception are her stock in trade. She seduced me, got herself with child, then ran away when she realized the responsibilities that came with her condition. That's a lie. Cheryl's voice cracked with the force of her denial. You forced yourself on me when I was alone and defenseless. I never consented to anything that happened between us. A wife's consent is not required, Raymond replied coldly. And you were my wife, regardless of your protestations. The child she carries is a James, and I'll not have it raised by strangers in some frontier hovel. Edward had been studying the marriage certificate with careful attention, and now he looked up with an expression that was hard to read. This document appears to be in order, Mr. James, but I'm curious about the circumstances surrounding the ceremony. Were there witnesses beyond those whose names appear here? Of course, Raymond said impatiently. My family's attorney was present, along with the minister who performed the ceremony. Everything was done according to proper form. And the bride's family, were they present to give their consent? Raymond's hesitation was brief but telling. Miss Anderson was of age and free to make her own decisions. Her guardians had no legal standing in the matter. But they weren't informed, Edward pressed. In fact, I'd wager they knew nothing about this marriage until after the fact. What they knew or didn't know is irrelevant, Raymond snapped. The marriage is legal and binding, and I have every right to reclaim my wife and child. Alexander had been listening to this exchange with growing anger, and now he stepped forward to face Raymond directly. Legal or not, no woman should be forced to return to a man who treats her as property. If Cheryl doesn't want to go with you, she won't be leaving this ranch. Raymond's smile was cold and predatory. I was hoping you'd say that, Mr. Moore. You see, interfering with a man's lawful claim to his wife is a serious crime, one that carries significant penalties. I'd hate to see you lose everything you've worked for over a woman who was never truly available to you. Alexander, please, Cheryl said, stepping between the two men. I won't have you suffer for my mistakes. I knew this day would come, knew that eventually I'd have to face the consequences of my flight. The only mistake you made was not coming to me with the truth from the beginning, Alexander replied, his eyes never leaving Raymond's face. But that doesn't change the fact that I won't stand by and watch you be dragged back to a life of misery. Edward had remained silent during this exchange, but now he cleared his throat meaningfully. Mr. James, I'm curious about something. You mentioned that someone broke into my office last night, searching through my files. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you? Raymond's expression didn't change, but Cheryl caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested the sheriff had struck close to the mark. I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about, Sheriff. I only arrived in your charming town this morning. Funny thing about that, Edward continued conversationally. The break-in happened sometime after midnight, but the hotel clerk says you checked in yesterday evening. Gives you plenty of time to have a look around, see what kind of information might have come in on the train. Are you accusing me of a crime, Sheriff? Raymond's voice carried a dangerous edge. Because I should warn you that the James family has considerable influence in Chicago, and we don't take kindly to harassment from small-town lawmen. Just making conversation, Edward replied mildly. Though I have to wonder what you thought you might find in my office. After all, if your claim to Mrs. James is as legitimate as you say, you shouldn't need to steal anything to prove it. Cheryl watched this verbal sparring with growing hope. The sheriff clearly suspected Raymond of the break-in, which meant he might be willing to question other aspects of the man's story. If she could find the courage to tell the truth about what had really happened in Chicago, perhaps there was still a chance to escape the trap that had been closing around her. Sheriff Reyes, she said, her voice stronger than it had been since Raymond's arrival. I need to tell you something about the circumstances of my marriage, something that might change how you view Mr. James's claims. Raymond's face darkened with fury. Anything my wife has to say can be discussed privately, between husband and wife. I won't have her airing our personal business before strangers. She's not your wife in any meaningful sense, Alexander said firmly. And if she has something to say, We're all going to listen. Edward nodded encouragingly. Go ahead, Mrs. James. Tell us what really happened in Chicago. Cheryl took a deep breath, gathering her courage for what might be the most important words she would ever speak. Raymond James cornered me in the house where I worked as a governess. My employers were away, and I was alone with the children when he arrived with his attorney and a minister he had bribed. He told me that if I didn't submit to the ceremony, he would see to it that my aunt and uncle lost their shop and were thrown into debtor's prison. Lies, Raymond snarled. She's a scheming little actress who got herself into trouble and is now trying to avoid the consequences. He forced me to sign the marriage certificate, Cheryl continued, ignoring his interruption. Then he sent the children away, and she faltered, the memories too painful to voice in front of these good people. And then he raped you, Martha said bluntly, her voice filled with righteous fury. That's what you're trying to say, isn't it, child? Cheryl nodded, unable to speak past the tears that clogged her throat. I tried to fight him, but he was too strong. Afterward, he told me that I belonged to him now, that no one would believe my word against his if I tried to tell anyone what had really happened. Alexander's face was white with rage, and his hand moved toward his rifle with deadly intent. You son of a bitch! You raped her and called it marriage. Careful, Mr. Moore, Raymond said, though his earlier confidence seemed to be wavering. Those are serious accusations, and I have witnesses who will testify to the legitimacy of my marriage. Witnesses you paid, Edward said quietly, men who were willing to look the other way while you committed a crime. That's not testimony, Mr. James, that's conspiracy. Raymond's composure finally cracked completely. You have no proof of any wrongdoing. The marriage certificate is legal, the child is mine, and I'll be taking both back to Chicago with me today. No, Cheryl said, her voice ringing with newfound strength. I won't go with you. I'd rather die than submit to your touch again. That can be arranged, Raymond snarled, his hand moving toward the gun at his hip. But Edward was faster, his own weapon clearing leather with practiced speed. I wouldn't if I were you. Drawing on a sheriff is a good way to end up dead, and I don't think your Chicago connections extend that far. The tableau held for a long moment, tension crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. Raymond's hand hovered over his gun, while Edward kept his own weapon trained on the man's chest, and Cheryl found herself holding her breath as she waited to see which way the confrontation would break. Finally, Raymond let his hand fall away from his weapon, though his eyes burned with frustrated fury. This isn't over, Sheriff. I have legal rights, and I'll see them enforced one way or another. Maybe you do, Edward acknowledged, but not today and not at gunpoint. I suggest you return to town and think carefully about your next move. Because if I find out you were behind that break-in, or if you make any threats against Mrs. James or anyone else in my jurisdiction, I'll see you in chains. Raymond's smile was cold and calculating as he remounted his horse. Don't worry, Sheriff. I'm a patient man, and I believe in working within the law. But make no mistake, I will have what belongs to me. As he rode away, followed by the men who had accompanied him, Cheryl felt her legs give way beneath her. Alexander caught her before she could fall, his strong arms supporting her weight as the full impact of the confrontation finally hit her. It's all right, he murmured, though she could hear the pain in his voice. He's gone for now. But he'll be back, she whispered against his chest. He'll never stop hunting me, never stop trying to claim what he thinks is his. Edward holstered his weapon and moved closer to where they stood. Maybe, but he's made some serious mistakes today. Breaking into my office was bad enough, but making threats in front of witnesses was just plain stupid. I might not be able to do anything about what happened in Chicago, but I can sure as hell make his life difficult here. Martha had been unusually quiet during the confrontation, but now she stepped forward with determination written across her weathered features. That man is dangerous, more dangerous than any of us realized. We need to get word to the other ranchers, make sure everyone knows what kind of snake has slithered into our midst. I'll handle that, Alexander said, though his attention remained focused on Cheryl's pale face. Right now, we need to get her inside and make sure she's all right. This kind of shock can't be good for someone in her condition. The mention of her pregnancy brought fresh tears to Cheryl's eyes. I'm so sorry, Alexander. I should have told you from the beginning. Should have been honest about everything. You deserve better than my lies and deception. What I deserved was the truth, he replied gently, but I understand why you felt you couldn't trust me with it. After what that bastard put you through, I'm amazed you had the courage to trust anyone at all. As they helped her back into the house, Cheryl felt a strange mixture of relief and terror warring in her chest. The truth was finally out, her secrets exposed to the harsh light of day. But Raymond's threats made it clear that her ordeal was far from over. If anything, the confrontation had only escalated the danger she faced. Edward followed them inside, his expression thoughtful as he considered the implications of what had just transpired. Mrs. James, I need to ask you some questions about what happened in Chicago. Details that might help me build a case against Raymond James. Of course, she said, settling into a chair by the fire with Alexander's steadying hand on her shoulder. I'll tell you whatever you need to know. Start with the night of the ceremony. You said your employers were away. Cheryl nodded, the memory still painful even after all these months. The Harrisons had gone to visit relatives in Springfield. They left me in charge of their 2 children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6. Raymond arrived around 9 in the evening, claiming he had business with Mr. Harrison. But you knew that wasn't true? I had seen him before, watching the house from across the street. He had been following me for weeks, ever since I refused his advances at a social gathering. When I told him Mr. Harrison wasn't home, he pushed his way inside and said he had come to see me. Edward made notes in a small notebook as she spoke. And the attorney and minister were already with him? They were waiting in a carriage outside. Raymond called them in once he had forced his way into the house. The attorney, a man named Whitmore, had all the papers already prepared. The minister looked uncomfortable, but he had clearly been paid well enough to overcome his scruples. What about the children? Were they present during the ceremony? Cheryl's voice dropped to a whisper. Raymond sent them to their rooms and told them not to come out no matter what they heard. They were terrified, poor things. I could hear the little girl crying through her bedroom door. Alexander's hand tightened on her shoulder and she could feel the anger radiating from him like heat from a forge. How long did the whole thing take? Perhaps half an hour for the ceremony itself. Raymond had thought of everything, even brought a ring that he forced onto my finger. Afterward, the attorney and minister left quickly, as if they couldn't wait to escape what they had participated in. And then, Edward prompted gently. Cheryl closed her eyes, the memories too painful to face while looking at these good people. Then Raymond claimed his husbandly rights. He said that no one would believe I hadn't consented to the marriage, that I was his property now, and would do as he commanded. The silence that followed her words was heavy with outrage and sympathy. Finally, Edward spoke again, his voice carefully controlled. Did you try to report what had happened to the authorities? The next day, after Raymond left, I went to the police station. But when I tried to tell them what had happened, they just laughed at me, said it was a domestic matter between husband and wife, and that I should be grateful such a wealthy man had chosen to make an honest woman of me. Bastards, Alexander muttered under his breath. The desk sergeant even suggested that I was probably lying about being forced, that I had gotten cold feet after the wedding night and was trying to cause trouble for my new husband. He warned me that making false accusations against a prominent citizen like Raymond James could land me in serious legal trouble. Edward's expression was grim as he continued taking notes. So you felt you had no choice but to run. I waited almost 2 months, hoping that Raymond would lose interest and leave me alone. But he kept coming to the Harrison house, making demands, treating me like his personal property. When I realized I was with child, I knew I had to get away before he found out. A pregnant wife would be even more valuable to him than just a wife. Why? Martha asked. What did he hope to gain from forcing you into marriage? Cheryl's laugh was bitter and hollow. Respectability. Raymond James has a reputation in Chicago society, but not the kind his family approves of. He's known for his association with gambling halls and brothels, for the way he treats women as disposable objects. His father had been pressuring him to settle down and produce an heir, to prove he could be a responsible member of the family business. So you were to be his path to redemption, Edward said with disgust. A respectable wife to clean up his image. Exactly. And when I proved inconveniently unwilling to play that role, He decided to simply take what he wanted by force. The fact that I was alone and vulnerable, with no family to protect me, made me the perfect target. Alexander had been listening with growing fury, and now he began pacing the small room like a caged animal. We can't let him take her back. There has to be something we can do, some way to fight this legally. Maybe, Edward said thoughtfully. The marriage was performed under duress, which might be grounds for annulment. And if I can prove he was behind the break-in at my office, I might be able to hold him long enough to get word to the authorities in Chicago. What good would that do? Cheryl asked hopelessly. You heard what I said about the police there. They're either bought and paid for by the James family or too prejudiced to care about the truth. Not all of them, Edward replied. I still have contacts in Chicago, men I worked with before I came west. Good men who might be willing to look into Raymond James's activities if they knew what to look for. For the first time since Raymond's arrival, Cheryl felt a flutter of hope in her chest. You really think there might be a way to fight him? I think Raymond James made a serious mistake when he followed you here, Edward said with quiet confidence. He's out of his element now, operating in territory where his family's influence means nothing. And he's already shown that he's willing to break the law to get what he wants. Martha had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke up with characteristic directness. All this legal maneuvering is well and good, but what happens if it doesn't work? What if this Raymond character decides to take matters into his own hands? The question hung in the air like a threat, and Cheryl felt her brief moment of hope begin to crumble. He won't give up, she said quietly. I know him too well to believe otherwise. If he can't get what he wants through legal means, he'll find another way. Then we'll be ready for him, Alexander said firmly. This is my land, and I'll defend what's mine. I'm not yours to defend, Cheryl said softly, though there was no reproach in her voice. I've brought nothing but trouble to your door, and I won't have you risk everything for a woman who deceived you from the moment she arrived. Alexander knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his own calloused ones. You didn't deceive me about the things that matter. I saw your kindness, your strength, your determination to build a better life. The rest is just details. Details, she repeated incredulously. Alexander, I'm carrying another man's child, a child conceived in violence and shame. How can you call that just details? Because the child isn't responsible for the circumstances of its conception, he replied simply. And neither are you. What matters is what we do from this point forward. Edward cleared his throat meaningfully. As touching as this is, we need to focus on practical matters. Raymond James isn't going to sit quietly in town while we sort out our feelings. He's going to be looking for ways to pressure us, to force our hand. What do you suggest? Alexander asked, though he didn't release Cheryl's hands. First, we need to get word to the other ranchers and townspeople about what kind of man we're dealing with. James is counting on being able to operate in secret, to use intimidation and legal pressure to get what he wants. If everyone knows the truth about him, it becomes much harder for him to work in the shadows. Martha nodded approvingly. I can handle that part. By tomorrow morning, every woman in 3 counties will know exactly what Raymond James did to this poor girl. Second, Edward continued, we need to document everything. Every threat, every attempt at intimidation, every suspicious activity. If we're going to build a case against him, we need evidence. And third, Alexander prompted. Edward's expression was grim as he met the other man's eyes. We prepare for the possibility that legal remedies won't be enough. Raymond James has already shown he's willing to use violence to get what he wants. If he decides to escalate things, we need to be ready. The implications of those words settled over the room like a dark cloud, and Cheryl felt the weight of responsibility for the danger she had brought to these good people. Maybe I should just leave, she said quietly. Go somewhere else, somewhere he can't find me. Running didn't work the first time, Alexander pointed out. What makes you think it would work now? At least then the rest of you would be safe. I won't have your blood on my hands because of my problems. Our problems now, Martha corrected firmly. Like it or not, girl, you're part of this community now. We don't abandon our own just because things get difficult. Edward stood and moved toward the door. his notebook tucked securely in his vest pocket. I'm going back to town to see what I can learn about James's activities. Alexander, I'd suggest you stay close to the ranch for the next few days. And Mrs. James, try not to worry too much. We've dealt with worse than Raymond James before. After the sheriff left, the three of them sat in contemplative silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the challenges that lay ahead. Finally, Alexander spoke, his voice heavy with concern. Cheryl, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me. She looked up at him, seeing the worry in his kind eyes. Of course, Lois. Are you certain the child is his? Is there any possibility that it might not be? The question hit her like a physical blow, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. You think I was lying about being forced? You think I willingly— No, he said quickly, reaching for her hands again. God, no, that's not what I meant at all. I just thought, maybe if there was some doubt about paternity, it might give us more legal options. Cheryl's laugh was bitter and hollow. There's no doubt, Alexander, I was a virgin when Raymond forced himself on me, and I haven't been with anyone since. The child is his, much as I wish it weren't. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was certain they wanted to cross. Alexander's face showed a mixture of pain and something else, something that might have been relief, though Cheryl couldn't understand why her confirmation of Raymond's paternity would bring him any comfort. I'm sorry, he said finally. I had to ask, for legal reasons, if nothing else. But it doesn't change anything between us. Doesn't it? She asked, studying his face carefully. Alexander, I'm carrying the child of a man who raped me, a man who will never stop trying to claim us both. How can that not change everything? Before he could answer, the sound of approaching horses once again drew their attention to the window. This time, however, the riders were familiar faces from town, and their expressions suggested they brought news rather than threats. Charles Mitchell dismounted first, his weathered face grim with purpose as he approached the house. Behind him rode Betty Hill and two other women Cheryl didn't recognize, their faces set with the kind of determination that suggested they had come on serious business. Alexander, Charles called as he reached the porch. We need to talk, all of us. They gathered in the main room, the women arranging themselves in a protective semicircle around Cheryl while the men stood near the door. Charles cleared his throat and began speaking without preamble. Word's already spreading about what happened here this morning. That James fellow made quite an impression in town, throwing around threats and acting like he owns the place. Sheriff Reyes filled us in on the details, and we wanted you to know that you've got support. Betty Hill stepped forward, her kind face creased with concern. Honey, what that man did to you in Chicago was an abomination. No woman should have to endure such treatment, and we won't stand by while he tries to drag you back to that hell. One of the other women, whom Cheryl now recognized as Donna Morgan from the general store, nodded emphatically. We've dealt with his type before. Men who think they can use money and influence to get away with anything. Well, he's not in Chicago anymore, and out here we take care of our own. The show of support was overwhelming, and Cheryl felt tears streaming down her face as she looked around at these people who barely knew her, yet were willing to stand against a dangerous man on her behalf. I don't know what to say. I never expected— You don't need to say anything, the third woman, Joan Sanders, interrupted gently. We know what it's like to be alone and afraid, to have nowhere to turn when the world seems set against you. That's what community means, standing together when one of us is threatened. Charles Mitchell's expression was grave as he addressed Alexander directly. That said, we need to be realistic about what we're up against. The James family has money and connections, and this Raymond character strikes me as the type who won't hesitate to use violence if legal pressure doesn't work. What are you suggesting? Alexander asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. We're suggesting that you and Cheryl might want to consider leaving the area for a while, Betty Hill said gently. Just until Sheriff Reyes can sort out the legal situation and maybe get some help from the authorities in Chicago. No, Cheryl said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. I won't run again. I spent months looking over my shoulder, jumping at every shadow, living in constant fear. I won't go back to that kind of existence. But if staying puts you and the baby in danger, Donna began. The baby will be in danger no matter where I go, Cheryl interrupted. Raymond will never stop hunting us, Never stop trying to claim what he thinks belongs to him. At least here, I have people willing to stand with me. That's more than I had in Chicago. Alexander moved to stand beside her chair, his presence solid and reassuring. She's right. Running would just delay the inevitable confrontation, and it would give James more time to prepare. Better to face him here, on our terms, with our friends around us. Joan Sanders looked skeptical. And what happens when he gets tired of legal maneuvering and decides to take more direct action? Are you prepared for that possibility? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Cheryl felt the weight of all their eyes upon her as she considered her response. The truth was, she wasn't prepared for violence, had never imagined that her flight from Chicago would lead to armed confrontation in the Montana wilderness. But the alternative, surrendering to Raymond's demands and returning to a life of abuse and degradation, was unthinkable. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I'm prepared for, or what I'm capable of when pushed to the edge. All I know is that I can't go back to being his victim." Charles Mitchell nodded approvingly. "That's the spirit we need to see. But spirit alone won't be enough if James decides to escalate things. We need to be smart about this, plan for different scenarios." "What did you have in mind?" Alexander asked. "First, we make sure you're never alone out here. Someone should always be within shouting distance, ready to ride for help if needed. Second, we establish a system of signals, ways to communicate danger quickly across the area. And third, we make sure everyone knows how to use a gun." The last suggestion made Cheryl's blood run cold. "I've never fired a weapon in my life. I wouldn't even know how to hold one properly." "Then you'll learn," Betty Hill said matter-of-factly. "It's a skill every frontier woman needs, and given your circumstances, it's not optional anymore." As the group continued discussing defensive preparations, Cheryl found her mind wandering to the child growing within her. What kind of world was she bringing this innocent life into? A world where its mother might have to take up arms to protect them both from the man who had fathered it through violence. The thought filled her with a despair so deep it threatened to drown her entirely. But then she looked around at the faces of these good people, saw the determination and compassion in their eyes, and felt a spark of something that might have been hope. Perhaps her child would grow up in a world where people stood together against injustice, where community meant more than blood or legal documents. Perhaps that was worth fighting for. The meeting continued for another hour with detailed discussions of patrol schedules, signal systems, and defensive positions. By the time the visitors prepared to leave, a comprehensive plan had been established to protect the ranch and its inhabitants from whatever Raymond James might attempt. As they mounted their horses to return to town, Charles Mitchell paused for a final word with Alexander. "You know this could get ugly fast, don't you? James doesn't strike me as the type to accept defeat gracefully." "I know," Alexander replied. "But some things are worth the risk." Charles glanced toward the house where Cheryl sat watching from the window. "She must be quite a woman to inspire such loyalty so quickly." "She is," Alexander said simply, "and she deserves better than what life has given her so far." After the visitors departed, Alexander and Cheryl found themselves alone for the first time since the morning's confrontation. Martha had gone to check on the livestock, leaving them to process the day's events in the quiet of the main room. "Are you having second thoughts?" Cheryl asked, studying Alexander's profile as he stared into the fire. "About defending me, I mean. It's not too late to change your mind." He turned to look at her, and she was struck by the intensity in his dark eyes. "The only thing I'm having second thoughts about is not asking you to marry me the moment you stepped off that train." The words hit her like a physical blow, and she felt her breath catch in her throat. "Alexander, you can't be serious. I'm already married, remember? And I'm carrying another man's child." "A marriage performed under duress isn't a real marriage," he replied firmly. "And as for the child, I meant what I said earlier. Children are innocent of their parents' sins. But what kind of life could we have together? Raymond will never stop hunting us, never stop trying to destroy whatever happiness we might find. Is that really what you want for yourself?" Alexander knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his own weathered ones. "What I want is you, Cheryl. I've wanted you since the moment I saw you on that train platform, and nothing that's happened today has changed that." If anything, knowing what you've survived, what you've overcome to get here, only makes me admire you more." Tears streamed down her face as she looked into his honest eyes and saw the truth of his words reflected there. "I don't deserve such devotion. I'm damaged goods, Alexander, broken in ways that may never heal." "We're all broken in some way," he replied gently. "The question is whether we let our wounds define us or whether we find the courage to heal together." Before she could respond, the sound of a single horse approaching at speed drew their attention back to the window. In the fading light of evening, they could see Sheriff Reyes riding hard toward the house, his face grim with urgency. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped and strode toward the house with the purposeful gait of a man bearing serious news. Alexander met him at the door, and Cheryl could hear their low voices conferring in urgent tones before they both entered the main room. "We have a problem," Edward announced without preamble. "James has been busy this afternoon, and he's not working alone anymore." "What do you mean?" Cheryl asked, though she was afraid she already knew the answer. "He's hired men, at least 4 that I've seen. Professional gunmen by the look of them, the kind who don't ask questions as long as the pay is good. They rode into town about an hour ago and went straight to the hotel where James is staying." Alexander's face darkened with anger. "So he's decided to abandon any pretense of legal action." "Looks that way. And there's more. One of the men he hired is Ryan Reyes, my own brother." Edward's voice was heavy with pain and disappointment. "Haven't seen him in 5 years, not since he chose the outlaw trail over honest work." The revelation hung in the air like a curse, and Cheryl felt her last hope begin to crumble. If Raymond had hired professional killers, including the sheriff's own brother, then the situation had moved far beyond anything their small community could handle. "What do we do now?" she asked, though she wasn't certain she wanted to hear the answer. Edward's expression was grim as he met her eyes. "Now we prepare for war." The weight of Edward's words settled over the room like a shroud, and Cheryl felt the last vestiges of her hope crumble into dust. Professional gunmen meant that Raymond had abandoned any pretense of civilized resolution, and the mention of the sheriff's own brother among their ranks added a layer of personal tragedies that made the situation even more dire. "Your brother," Alexander said quietly, his voice heavy with sympathy. "Edward, I'm sorry." Edward's jaw tightened with pain and resolve. "Ryan made his choices long ago. I tried to save him from that path, but some people are determined to walk into hell no matter who tries to pull them back." He moved to the window, peering out into the gathering darkness. "Doesn't change what we're facing, though. 4 armed men, maybe more, and they're not bound by any law except the one that comes from Raymond James's wallet." Martha had returned from her evening chores and stood in the doorway, her weathered face grim as she absorbed the implications of the sheriff's news. "So what's the plan? We can't fight professional killers with good intentions and borrowed rifles." "We don't fight them," Edward replied, turning back to face the group. "We outsmart them. James is counting on intimidation and overwhelming force to get what he wants. He expects us to either surrender Cheryl without a fight or make some desperate last stand that ends with everyone dead." "What's the alternative?" Cheryl asked, though she feared the answer might involve more running, more hiding, more of the desperate flight that had brought her to this place. Edward's expression was calculating as he considered their options. "We make James come to us, on our terms, in a situation where his hired guns can't operate effectively. And we make sure there are witnesses, people who can testify to whatever happens here." Alexander nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes. "You're talking about forcing a confrontation." "I'm talking about ending this once and for all," Edward corrected. "James won't stop hunting Cheryl as long as he thinks he can win. We need to show him that the cost of pursuing her is higher than he's willing to pay." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their discussion, and through the window they could see torches moving across the prairie in their direction. But these were not the scattered lights of a small group. This was a column of riders, at least a dozen strong, moving with the purposeful advance of an organized force. "Our neighbors," Martha observed with satisfaction. "Word travels fast out here, and folks don't take kindly to hired killers threatening their own." Charles Mitchell led the group, his weathered face set with determination as he dismounted near the porch. Behind him came men Cheryl recognized from town, along with others she had never seen, ranchers and farmers, and townspeople united by a common cause. They carried rifles and shotguns, and their expressions left no doubt about their intentions. "Alexander," Charles called as he approached the house. "We heard about James's new friends. Figured you might need some company tonight." Edward stepped onto the porch to address the assembled men. "This isn't your fight, Charles. James hired professional gunmen, men who kill for money. This could get ugly fast." "All the more reason we need to stick together," replied Tom Harrison, a rancher from the next valley over. "We've all got wives and daughters, Sheriff. If we let men like James get away with terrorizing women in our territory, where does it end?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the group, and Cheryl felt overwhelmed by the show of support from people who barely knew her. In Chicago, she had been alone and friendless, with no one to turn to when Raymond had destroyed her life. Here, in this harsh frontier landscape, she had found something she had never expected: a community willing to risk everything to protect one of their own. "What's the plan?" asked Bill Morrison, the town's blacksmith, hefting his rifle with practiced ease. Edward looked out over the assembled faces, seeing the determination and courage that had built this territory from nothing but wilderness and hope. "We're going to give James exactly what he wants: a chance to take Cheryl back to Chicago." "Edward, no," Alexander said sharply. "We can't use her as bait." "We're not using her as bait," Edward replied calmly. "We're using his obsession with her to draw him into a situation where he can't win. James thinks he holds all the cards because he has hired guns and legal documents. We're going to show him that neither of those things matters when you're outnumbered 20-1 by angry farmers with nothing to lose." Cheryl stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear that churned in her stomach. "What exactly are you proposing, Sheriff?" "Tomorrow morning you're going to ride into town, alone, apparently defenseless, looking like you've decided to surrender to James's demands. He'll see it as his moment of triumph, the chance to claim his prize in front of witnesses." "And then," she asked, though she was beginning to understand the shape of his plan. "Then we spring the trap. Every man here will be positioned around town, hidden but ready. When James makes his move, when he tries to force you to go with him, we'll be there to make sure the law is properly enforced." Alexander's face was pale with worry. "It's too dangerous. If something goes wrong, if James suspects a trap—" "Then we'll deal with that when it happens," Edward said firmly. "But this is our best chance to end this without a bloodbath. James is arrogant enough to believe he's already won. We use that arrogance against him." The discussion continued for another hour with detailed planning of positions, signals, and contingencies. By the time the meeting broke up, every aspect of the trap had been carefully considered and assigned. The men would spend the night in shifts, watching the approaches to the ranch and making sure James's hired guns didn't attempt a night attack. As the group dispersed to take up their positions, Alexander walked Cheryl back into the house, his face heavy with concern. "I don't like this plan. Too many things could go wrong." "All the alternatives are worse," she replied, settling into her chair by the fire. "At least this way we're taking action instead of just waiting for Raymond to make his move." Martha busied herself preparing coffee for the men on watch, but Cheryl could see the worry in the older woman's movements. "You don't have to do this, child. There are other ways, other places you could go." "No," Cheryl said firmly. "I'm tired of running, tired of being afraid. Whatever happens tomorrow, at least I'll face it standing up instead of cowering in some hiding place." The night passed slowly, punctuated by the quiet movements of the men on guard duty and the occasional challenge and response as they identified each other in the darkness. Cheryl dozed fitfully in her chair, unwilling to retire to her room where she would be cut off from news of any developments. She woke before dawn to find Alexander sitting across from her, his rifle across his knees as he kept watch through the window. "Any trouble?" she asked softly. "Nothing yet. Edward thinks they'll wait for daylight, try to make their move when they can see what they're doing." He turned to look at her, his eyes dark with worry. "Are you sure about this, Cheryl? There's still time to change the plan." "I'm sure," she said, though her voice trembled slightly with the weight of what lay ahead. "I've been running from Raymond James for months, and it's time to stop. Whatever happens today, at least it will be finished." As the sun crested the horizon, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, Edward returned to the house with final instructions. The men are in position around town. Charles will be in the general store, Tom at the livery stable, Bill in his smithy. Everyone knows their role. And your brother? Alexander asked. What happens when you have to face him? Edward's expression was grim but resolute. Ryan made his choice when he took James's money. If he stands in the way of justice, I'll treat him like any other criminal. The words carried a weight of personal anguish that made Cheryl's heart ache for the sheriff. Bad enough that she had to face the man who had violated and terrorized her. Edward would be confronting his own brother across the barrel of a gun. I'm ready, she said, rising from her chair and smoothing her skirts. She had chosen her most respectable dress, the one that best concealed her condition while still allowing her freedom of movement. If this was to be her final confrontation with Raymond James, she would meet it with dignity and tact. Alexander helped her into the wagon, his hands lingering on hers as if he could transfer some of his strength through touch alone. Remember, you're not alone out there. We'll all be watching, ready to move the moment James shows his hand. The ride into town felt like a journey to her own execution, each turn of the wagon wheels bringing her closer to a confrontation she had been dreading for months. But beneath the fear, she felt something else growing. A cold anger at the man who had destroyed her life and forced her to flee across a continent in search of safety. Cedar Ridge appeared quiet in the morning light, but Cheryl could sense the hidden tension in the seemingly peaceful scene. Shopkeepers went about their morning routines, but she caught glimpses of rifle barrels in windows and the subtle positioning of men who should have been elsewhere. The trap was set. Now all that remained was to see if the prey would take the bait. She guided the wagon to a stop in front of the hotel where Raymond was staying, her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone in town could hear it. For a moment she sat frozen, unable to force herself to climb down and walk into what might be her doom. Then the hotel door opened, and Raymond James stepped onto the boardwalk, his pale eyes lighting up with triumph as he saw her sitting alone and apparently defenseless. Behind him came his hired guns, 4 hard-faced men whose hands rested casually on their weapons. But it was the 5th man who made her breath catch in her throat. Ryan Reyes bore a strong resemblance to his brother. But where Edward's face showed integrity and compassion, Ryan's features were marked by cruelty and avarice. Well, well, Raymond said, his voice carrying clearly across the dusty street. I was beginning to think you intended to make this difficult, my dear. How refreshing to see that you've finally come to your senses. Cheryl climbed down from the wagon with careful dignity, her chin raised in defiance despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. I've come to hear what you have to say, Raymond. Nothing more. His smile was cold and predatory as he approached, his hired guns spreading out behind him in a loose semicircle that effectively cut off any escape routes. What I have to say is quite simple. You're my wife, and you're coming home with me. Today. I am not your wife in any way that matters, she replied, her voice carrying more strength than she felt. What you did to me in Chicago was rape, not marriage. The ceremony was performed under duress, and any court that isn't bought and paid for by your family would recognize it as invalid. Raymond's expression darkened at her defiance, and she caught a glimpse of the violent temper that lurked beneath his civilized facade. Careful, darling. You're in no position to make accusations or demands. I have 4 armed men who disagree with your assessment of our legal relationship. And I have the truth, she said simply. Sometimes that's enough. Truth, Raymond laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Truth is what I say it is, backed by the power to enforce my will. You learned that lesson in Chicago, and you'll learn it again today. From her position in the middle of the street, Cheryl could see movement in the shadows of the surrounding buildings. Her protectors were in position, waiting for the signal that would spring their trap. But she also saw something else. More men emerging from the buildings across town, strangers with the hard look of professional killers. Raymond had brought more than 4 guns to this confrontation. You seem nervous, my dear, Raymond observed, following her gaze. Perhaps you are beginning to understand the futility of resistance. I told you I would have what belongs to me, and I always keep my promises. She doesn't belong to you, a voice called from across the street, and Cheryl's heart leaped as she saw Alexander emerging from the alley beside the bank. He walked with steady purpose, his rifle held ready but not yet aimed, his face set with determination. Raymond's smile widened as he saw the other man, Ah, the gallant rancher. How touching that you've come to bid farewell to your lady friend. Though I suppose she was never really yours to begin with, was she? She's her own person, Alexander replied, taking a position that put him between Cheryl and Raymond's guns. And she's made her choice. You're not welcome here, James. Welcome, Baitite. Raymond's laugh was like breaking glass. I don't need to be welcome. I have legal documents and the means to enforce them. Your opinion on the matter is irrelevant. More men began emerging from the buildings around the street, but Cheryl's heart sank as she realized that for every ally who revealed himself, another of Raymond's hired killers appeared to counter him. What should have been an overwhelming advantage in numbers was rapidly becoming an even match. And even matches between farmers and professional gunmen rarely ended well for the farmers. Edward Reyes stepped out of the sheriff's office, his badge catching the morning light as he surveyed the tense standoff developing in his town. That's enough, he called, his voice carrying the authority of law and long experience. James, you and your men need to move along. There's nothing for you here. On the contrary, Sheriff, Raymond replied smoothly, I'm here to reclaim my wife and unborn child, both of whom belong to me under the laws of Illinois and the United States. Surely you're not planning to interfere with the lawful exercise of a husband's rights. I'm planning to prevent a crime, Edward said firmly. And forcing a woman to return to an abusive marriage against her will is definitely a crime in my jurisdiction. Ryan Reyes stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun butt as he faced his brother across the dusty street. Hello, Eddie. Been a long time. The pain that flashed across Edward's face was visible even at a distance, but his voice remained steady. Ryan, I'd hoped you might have found a better path by now. This path pays well enough, Ryan replied with a cold smile, and it's about to pay even better. Mr. James is offering a substantial bonus for anyone who helps him resolve this situation quickly. Don't do this, Ryan. These are good people, and they don't deserve what you're planning to bring down on them. Good people? Ryan's laugh was bitter. Like the good people who ran me out of town for one mistake? Like the good people who wouldn't give me a second chance when I needed it most? You made more than one mistake, Edward said quietly, and you know it, but it's not too late to make a better choice now. The brothers faced each other across the street, years of pain and disappointment hanging between them like a tangible barrier. Around them, the tension continued to build as more armed men took positions, turning the main street of Cedar Ridge into a powder keg waiting for a spark. Touching as this family reunion is, Raymond interrupted, I have business to conclude. Cheryl, you have exactly 1 minute to get in that wagon and come with me voluntarily. After that, my men will escort you, and anyone who interferes will be dealt with accordingly. Cheryl felt the weight of every eye upon her as she stood in the center of the street, the focal point of a confrontation that could leave half the town dead before the sun reached its zenith. The child within her seemed to sense the danger, shifting restlessly as if trying to escape the violence that threatened to engulf them all. I won't go with you, she said, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. I'd rather die here, among people who care about me, than live another day as your prisoner. Raymond's mask of civility finally slipped completely, revealing the monster beneath. Then you'll get your wish, you stubborn bitch. Boys, take her. Kill anyone who gets in your way. The first shot came from Ryan Reyes, aimed not at his brother, but at Alexander, who dove behind a water trough as the bullet splintered the wood beside his head. The sound of gunfire shattered the morning quiet like breaking glass. And suddenly the street erupted into chaos as men scrambled for cover and began returning fire. Cheryl found herself caught in the middle of the maelstrom, bullets whining past her head as she desperately sought shelter. A strong hand grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the boardwalk, and she looked up to see Martha Robinson, her weathered face set with determination as she dragged the younger woman to safety behind the thick posts of the general store's porch. Stay down, Martha shouted over the gunfire. Let the men handle this. But even as she spoke, one of Raymond's hired killers was advancing on their position, his gun aimed directly at Cheryl's hiding place. Martha saw the threat and reacted without hesitation, producing a shotgun from beneath her shawl and firing both barrels into the man's chest. He crumpled to the ground, his weapon spinning away across the dusty street. Told you every frontier woman needs to know how to use a gun, Martha said grimly, breaking open the shotgun to reload. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The confined space of the main street turning into a killing ground as men fought from doorways and windows and behind overturned wagons. Cheryl watched in horror as Charles Mitchell took a bullet in the shoulder but kept firing, as Tom Harrison's hat was shot clean off his head, as Bill Morrison charged across the street with a roar of fury to tackle one of the gunmen who was threatening the schoolhouse where children might still be hiding. Through it all, she was aware of Alexander's voice calling her name, of his desperate attempts to reach her position while under heavy fire. She could see him moving from cover to cover, working his way closer despite the bullets that sought his life with every step. Edward and Ryan Reyes had found each other in the chaos, and their personal battle played out against the larger conflict like a Greek tragedy made manifest. The brothers circled each other in the middle of the street, their guns drawn but not yet fired, years of pain and betrayal written in their faces. "It doesn't have to end this way," Edward called over the gunfire. "You can still walk away from this." "Too late for that," Ryan replied, his voice heavy with regret and determination. "I made my choice when I took James's money. Can't unmake it now." You can always make a better choice. That's what second chances are for. For a moment, Ryan's resolve seemed to waver, and Cheryl saw something that might have been the man he had once been before life, and bad decisions had hardened him into what he had become. But then Raymond's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Finish him, Reyes. I'm not paying you to have a family reunion." The spell broke, and Ryan's face hardened again as he raised his gun. But instead of aiming at his brother, he turned toward Raymond James with cold fury in his eyes. "Nobody talks to me like that. Nobody." The shot took Raymond in the chest, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the side of a building. He slid down the wall, leaving a trail of blood on the weathered wood, his pale eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "You shot me," he gasped, his hands pressed against the spreading stain on his shirt. "You work for me." "You can't shoot me." "I work for whoever pays me," Ryan replied coldly, "but I don't work for men who think they can treat me like dirt. Consider this my resignation." The gunfire began to slacken as Raymond's remaining men realized their employer was down and their leader among the hired guns had switched sides. One by one they began throwing down their weapons and raising their hands, unwilling to continue a fight they could no longer win. Edward approached his brother cautiously, his gun still drawn but lowered. "Ryan, what happens now?" "Now I face the consequences of my choices," Ryan replied, dropping his own weapon and raising his hands. "I've got warrants in 3 states and blood on my hands that won't wash clean. But maybe shooting that bastard will count for something when I stand before the judge." Alexander had finally reached Cheryl's position, and she felt his arms close around her with desperate relief. "Are you hurt? Did they touch you?" "I'm fine," she whispered against his chest, though she was shaking so hard she could barely stand. "Is it over? Is Raymond really dead?" They looked across the street to where Raymond James lay crumpled against the building, his expensive clothes stained with blood and dust. Edward was kneeling beside him, checking for signs of life, but even from a distance they could see that the man who had terrorized Cheryl across half a continent would never hurt anyone again. "He's dead," Edward called, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "It's over." The words seemed to break some invisible dam, and suddenly Cheryl was sobbing against Alexander's chest, months of fear and tension pouring out of her in great, wrenching gasps. She had lived so long with the constant threat of Raymond's pursuit that his death felt almost impossible to believe. "Shh," Alexander murmured, his hand stroking her hair as he held her close. "You're safe now. He can never hurt you again." Around them, the town began to stir back to life as people emerged from their hiding places to survey the damage. Several men had been wounded in the gunfight, but miraculously, no one on their side had been killed. The same could not be said for Raymond's hired guns. 3 of them lay dead in the street, while the 4th sat propped against a hitching post with a bullet in his leg. Dr. Samuel Pierce, the town's physician, moved among the wounded with practiced efficiency, tending to injuries and determining who needed immediate attention. Charles Mitchell's shoulder wound was painful but not serious, while Tom Harrison sported a graze across his forehead that made him look more dramatic than he actually was. Edward was organizing the cleanup, directing men to remove the bodies and secure the surviving gunmen for transport to the territorial prison. But his eyes kept returning to his brother, who sat quietly on the steps of the sheriff's office with his hands shackled in front of him. "What will happen to him?" Cheryl asked, following Edward's gaze. "He'll stand trial for the crimes he's committed," Edward replied. "But shooting Raymond James might earn him some consideration from the judge. That man was wanted in connection with several other cases of forced marriage and extortion. Ryan may have done the territory a favor." Martha Robinson approached with a cup of coffee for Cheryl, her weathered face creased with concern. "How are you holding up, child? That was quite an ordeal." "I'm still trying to believe it's really over," Cheryl admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. "For so long, Raymond's pursuit has dominated every aspect of my life. I'm not sure who I am without that fear driving me." "You're a woman with choices now," Martha said firmly. "Real choices, not the desperate flight you've been living with. The question is, what do you want to do with your freedom?" Cheryl looked around at the faces of the people who had risked everything to protect her, at the town that had become a battleground because of her presence, at Alexander, who stood beside her with patient devotion written in every line of his face. "I want to stay," she said quietly, "if you'll have me. If Alexander will still have me, knowing everything he knows now." Alexander's smile was radiant as he took her hands in his own. "I told you before, Cheryl, I've wanted you since the moment I saw you step off that train. Nothing that's happened has changed that. Even knowing about the child, about its parentage?" "Especially knowing about the child," he replied firmly. "That baby is innocent of its father's crimes, and it deserves to be raised with love and security. I'd be honored to be the father it needs." Edward approached with a leather satchel in his hands, his expression thoughtful. "Cheryl, I found this among Raymond's belongings. I think you should see what's inside." She opened the satchel with trembling fingers, revealing a collection of documents that told the story of Raymond's obsession with finding her. There were reports from private investigators, copies of train schedules, even photographs of her taken without her knowledge during her flight across the country. But it was the letter at the bottom of the satchel that made her gasp with recognition. It was the correspondence she had sent to Alexander before leaving Chicago, the letter that had begun their relationship and brought her to Cedar Ridge. Somehow Raymond had intercepted it and used the information to track her to this remote corner of Montana. "He knew," she whispered, staring at her own handwriting. "He knew exactly where I was going and who I was meeting. That's how he found me so quickly." Edward's expression was grim as he examined the letter. "He's been planning this for months, maybe longer. The break-in at my office wasn't random. He was looking for any other correspondence that might give him leverage over you." Alexander took the letter from her shaking hands, his face darkening as he read the words she had written in hope and desperation so many months ago. "This changes nothing between us," he said firmly. "If anything, it makes me admire your courage even more. You reached out for help when you had nowhere else to turn, and you found your way to exactly where you belonged. But if Raymond hadn't intercepted this letter, if he hadn't followed me here, none of this would have happened. Those men wouldn't have died, the town wouldn't have been put in danger. And you'd still be living in fear," Martha interrupted. "Still looking over your shoulder, still wondering when he'd find you. At least now it's finished. You can build a real life instead of just surviving from day to day." As the afternoon wore on, the cleanup continued and life in Cedar Ridge began to return to something approaching normal. The bodies were removed, the wounded were tended, and the surviving gunman was secured for transport to face justice. Ryan Reyes was treated with careful respect despite his shackles, his act of shooting Raymond James having earned him a measure of redemption in the eyes of the townspeople. "I want to thank you," Edward said to his brother, as they prepared for the journey to the territorial capital. "What you did today, turning on James like that, it took courage." Ryan's smile was sad but genuine. "Maybe I finally remembered what you tried to teach me all those years ago, that some things matter more than money." "It's not too late to make a fresh start," Edward said quietly. "When you get out of prison, if you want to come back here, there might be a place for you." We'll see, Ryan replied. I've got a lot to atone for before I can think about fresh starts. But thanks for the offer, Eddie. It means more than you know. As evening approached, Cheryl found herself standing on the porch of Alexander's house, looking out over the prairie that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The events of the day felt like a dream, too dramatic and violent to be real. But the absence of the fear that had been her constant companion for months was proof enough that her ordeal was truly over. Having second thoughts? Alexander asked, joining her at the porch rail. About staying? No. About everything else? Maybe. She turned to face him, seeing the patience and understanding in his dark eyes. I'm going to need time, Alexander. Time to heal from what Raymond did to me. Time to prepare for the baby. Time to figure out who I am when I'm not running from something. We have all the time in the world, he replied, taking her hand in his gentle grasp. And when you're ready, when you had time to heal and decide what you really want, I'll be here. What if I'm never ready? What if the damage is too deep to ever fully heal? Alexander was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. Then we'll work with whatever healing is possible. Love isn't about perfection, Cheryl. It's about accepting someone exactly as they are and choosing to build something beautiful together anyway. The words brought tears to her eyes, but they were tears of gratitude rather than sorrow. I don't deserve such patience, such kindness. You deserve everything good this world has to offer, he replied firmly. And I intend to spend whatever time we have together making sure you remember that. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Martha called them in for supper, her voice carrying the same practical warmth that had welcomed Cheryl on her first day in this place that had become home. They sat around the kitchen table, sharing a simple meal and talking quietly about plans for the future, about the ranch in the coming winter, and the child who would arrive in the spring. Have you thought about names? Martha asked, refilling their coffee cups with practiced efficiency. Cheryl's hand moved instinctively to her growing belly, feeling the flutter of movement that had become more frequent in recent weeks. I've been afraid to think too far ahead. But now, she looked around the table at these people who had become her family, who had fought and bled to protect her from a monster she couldn't escape on her own. Now I think I'd like to choose something that honors this place, these people who gave me a second chance. Whatever you choose will be perfect, Alexander said, covering her hand with his own. This child will be loved and wanted, regardless of the circumstances of its conception. Later that evening, as Cheryl prepared for bed in the room that had become her sanctuary, she found herself thinking about the letter Edward had found among Raymond's possessions, the words she had written in desperation and hope, the plea for help that had brought her to this place where she had found not just safety, but something approaching happiness. She pulled out paper and pen, settling at the small desk by her window to compose new words, different words, words that spoke not of desperation, but of gratitude and possibility. This letter would not be sent to anyone. It was for her own heart, a record of how far she had come from the terrified woman who had fled Chicago in the dark of night. Dear Alexander, she wrote, though he slept just down the hallway. When I first wrote to you, I was running from a nightmare that seemed to have no end. I was broken in ways I didn't even understand, carrying secrets that felt too heavy to bear alone. I thought I was seeking nothing more than shelter from the storm that had become my life. She paused, looking out at the prairie that stretched endlessly under the star-filled sky. Somewhere out there, other women might be running from their own nightmares, seeking their own shelter from storms that threatened to destroy them. She hoped they would find what she had found here, not just safety, but the possibility of healing, of love, of building something beautiful from the ashes of what had been destroyed. But what I found was so much more than shelter, she continued writing. I found a community willing to fight for justice, friends willing to risk everything for someone they barely knew, and a man whose love is patient enough to wait for healing and strong enough to help carry the burdens I cannot yet set down. The baby moved within her, a gentle reminder of the future that was growing despite the violence of its conception. This child would know nothing of Raymond James except what history required. It would be raised with love and security, surrounded by people who had chosen to protect and cherish it regardless of the circumstances that brought it into the world. I am no longer the frightened woman who stepped off that train, she wrote. I am someone new, someone stronger, someone who has learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. I have learned that family is not always blood, that home is not always the place you were born, and that love can bloom even in the harshest soil if it is tended with patience and care. She set down her pen and folded the letter carefully, placing it in the drawer where she kept her few precious possessions. Someday, perhaps, she would share these words with Alexander, with their child, with others who might need to hear that redemption was possible even after the darkest chapters of life. The next morning brought news that Ryan Reyes had been transported to the territorial capital without incident, and that the surviving gunman had provided testimony that would help close several unsolved cases involving Raymond James's criminal activities. Edward stopped by the ranch to deliver the news and to return some of Cheryl's belongings that had been found among Raymond's possessions. Looks like James had been planning on this for even longer than we thought, Edward said, setting a small trunk on the kitchen table. He had investigators tracking you for months before you even left Chicago. You were never as safe as you thought during your journey west. Cheryl opened the trunk with trembling fingers, finding clothes and personal items she had thought lost forever. But it was the small portrait of her parents, the last connection to her life before Raymond's violence had destroyed everything, that made her break down in tears. "I thought I'd lost this forever," she whispered, clutching the portrait to her chest. "It's the only picture I have of them." Alexander's arms came around her, offering comfort and strength as she grieved not just for her parents, but for the innocence that had been stolen from her, for the life she might have lived if Raymond James had never entered it. But even through her tears, she felt something she had not experienced in months: the freedom to mourn without fear, to feel her emotions fully without the constant need to be ready to run. "He can never hurt you again," Alexander murmured against her hair. "You're safe now. You're home." The word home resonated through her like a bell, carrying with it all the promise and possibility she had thought lost forever. This ranch, this community, these people who had fought for her when she could not fight for herself, they had become more than shelter from the storm. They had become the foundation upon which she could build a new life. Over the following weeks, as autumn deepened into winter, Cheryl found herself settling into routines that felt like the beginning of genuine happiness. She helped Martha with the household tasks, learning the skills that would make her a proper frontier wife. She spent hours talking with Alexander about his plans for the ranch, about the future they might build together, about the child who would arrive with the spring. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge had embraced her completely, their initial curiosity transformed into protective affection by the dramatic events that had brought Raymond James to his end. Betty Hill and the other women visited regularly, sharing advice about pregnancy and childbirth, offering friendship without judgment or prying questions about the past. "You're blooming," Martha observed one afternoon as they worked together preparing preserves for the winter. "I can see it in your face, in the way you carry yourself. The fear is finally leaving you." It was true, the constant tension that had been her companion for so long was gradually easing, replaced by something that felt almost like peace. She still had nightmares sometimes, still flinched when men approached too quickly or spoke too loudly, but the healing was beginning in earnest. Alexander was endlessly patient with her recovery, never pushing for more intimacy than she was ready to offer, content to build their relationship slowly on a foundation of trust and mutual respect. They spent their evenings talking by the fire, sharing stories of their pasts and dreams for their future, learning each other's hearts with the careful attention of people who understood that love was too precious to be rushed. "I've been thinking about the wedding," he said one evening, as they sat watching the first snow of the season fall outside their window. Cheryl's hand moved instinctively to her belly, now visibly rounded with the growing child. "People will talk. A pregnant bride, especially one whose husband died so recently." "Let them talk," Alexander replied firmly. "Anyone who matters knows the truth about what Raymond James did to you, and anyone who doesn't matter can keep their opinions to themselves. Are you sure you want to marry me before the baby comes? It would be easier to wait, to let people think the child is yours from the beginning." Alexander took her hands in his eyes serious as he met her gaze. "I want to marry you because I love you, not because of what people might think or say." And I want that child to be born into a family where it's wanted and cherished, regardless of the circumstances of its conception. The proposal, when it finally came, was simple and heartfelt, offered on a quiet evening as they sat by the fire watching the flames dance in the hearth. There were no grand gestures or elaborate speeches, just Alexander dropping to one knee beside her chair and offering his heart with the same quiet sincerity that had drawn her to him from the beginning. "Cheryl Anderson," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Will you let me be the father your child needs and the husband you deserve?" Her answer came through tears of joy rather than sorrow, the first purely happy tears she had shed in longer than she could remember. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, "Yes, Alexander Moore, I will marry you." The wedding took place on a crisp December morning, with the entire community of Cedar Ridge in attendance to witness the union of two people who had found love in the aftermath of violence and loss. Cheryl wore a dress of deep blue silk that Martha had altered to accommodate her growing figure, and carried a bouquet of winter flowers that Betty Hill had somehow managed to cultivate in the harsh climate. Edward Reyes performed the ceremony, his badge replaced by a preacher's collar for the occasion, his words carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed both the worst and best of human nature. "Love," he said as the couple stood before him, "is not always easy or convenient. Sometimes it asks us to be braver than we thought possible, to forgive what seems unforgivable, to build something beautiful from the ruins of what came before." As they exchanged vows, Cheryl felt the last of her fears finally release their hold on her heart. This was not the forced ceremony that Raymond had subjected her to, but a true union based on choice and love and the promise of a shared future. When Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger, it was with reverence and joy rather than possession and control. The celebration that followed was simple but heartfelt, with music and dancing and enough food to feed half the territory. Charles Mitchell played his fiddle while the couples danced, and even Martha was persuaded to take a turn around the floor with Dr. Pierce, her weathered face bright with uncharacteristic joy. As the evening wore on and the guests began to depart for their own homes, Cheryl found herself standing once again on the porch of what was now truly her home, looking out over the snow-covered prairie that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. But this time she was not alone. Alexander stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, sharing the view of Hermopos and the promise it represented. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. "Only that it took so long to get here," she replied, leaning into his warmth. "But maybe we needed all those dark miles to appreciate the light when we finally found it." The baby chose that moment to move within her, a strong kick that made them both laugh with surprise and delight. "I think someone approves of the new arrangements," Alexander said, placing his hand over hers on her belly. "Our child," Cheryl said, testing the words and finding them perfect. "Not his, not mine, but ours. A new beginning for all of us." As winter deepened and spring approached, Cheryl's pregnancy progressed without complication. Dr. Pierce pronounced both mother and child healthy, and Martha began preparing the house for the arrival of its newest member. A cradle appeared in the bedroom, crafted by Bill Morrison with the same careful attention he brought to his blacksmith work. Betty Hill and the other women organized a quilting bee, creating a beautiful covering that would keep the baby warm through its first Montana winter. The nightmares came less frequently now, and when they did, Alexander was there to hold her until the fear passed and peace returned. She had told him everything about her ordeal with Raymond, holding nothing back, and his response had been to love her more fiercely, not less. The shame that had eaten at her for so long began to transform into something else. Not pride, perhaps, but a quiet recognition that she had survived something that might have destroyed a weaker person. "You're stronger than you know," he told her one evening as they sat planning the nursery. "Stronger than Raymond James ever was, stronger than the fear that drove you here. That strength is what our child will inherit from you." The baby arrived on a warm May morning, after a labor that was difficult but not dangerous. Martha and Betty Hill served as midwives, their experienced hands guiding the process with calm efficiency, while Alexander paced the kitchen and wore a path in the floorboards with his worried footsteps. When the cry finally came, strong and indignant at being forced from its warm sanctuary into the cold world, Cheryl felt a love so fierce and immediate that it took her breath away. This child, conceived in violence but born into love, was perfect in every way that mattered. A daughter, Martha announced, placing the squirming bundle in Cheryl's arms. Healthy and strong, with a good set of lungs on her. Alexander entered the room with reverent steps, his face awestruck as he looked down at the tiny person who had just joined their family. "She's beautiful," he whispered, reaching out to touch one impossibly small hand with his work-roughened finger. "Perfect." "Elizabeth," Cheryl said, the name coming to her as naturally as breathing. Elizabeth Hope Moore, for new beginnings in the people who made them possible. "Elizabeth Hope," Alexander repeated, testing the name and finding it exactly right. "Hello, little one. Welcome to your family." As summer arrived and Elizabeth grew from a tiny bundle into a person with her own preferences and personality, Cheryl found herself marveling at the transformation in her own life. The terrified woman who had stepped off the train in Cedar Ridge less than a year ago seemed like a stranger now, someone she might have known once but could barely remember. She had learned to shoot, as Martha had insisted, and while she hoped never to need the skill, the knowledge that she could protect herself and her daughter if necessary gave her a confidence she had never possessed before. She had learned to drive the wagon, to manage the household accounts, to plan meals for harvest crews and social gatherings. She had become, in short, exactly the kind of woman she had pretended to be in her letters to Alexander. Strong, capable, ready to build a life on the frontier. "Do you ever think about him?" Alexander asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching Elizabeth sleep in her basket, the baby's face peaceful in the golden light of sunset. Cheryl knew he meant Raymond, the man whose violence had brought them together in the strangest possible way. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not with fear anymore. Sometimes I almost feel grateful to him, which is terrible, I know. But if he hadn't done what he did, I never would have found you, never would have found this place and these people. I never would have become the person I was meant to be." "That's not terrible," Alexander said gently. "That's healing. You've taken something evil and transformed it into something good. That takes a kind of courage most people never have to find." As autumn returned and Elizabeth celebrated her first harvest festival, Cheryl realized that she had finally found what she had been searching for without even knowing it. Not just safety, not just shelter from the storm, but a place where she belonged completely, where her past was known and accepted and her future was full of promise. Edward Reyes stopped by regularly, bringing news from the outside world and updates on his brother's progress toward rehabilitation. Ryan had been sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison, but his testimony about Raymond James's criminal network had helped close dozens of cases and bring justice to other victims. There was talk that he might be released early for good behavior and his cooperation with the authorities. "He asks about you sometimes," Edward told Cheryl during one of his visits. "Wants to know if you're happy, if the baby is healthy." "I think shooting Raymond James was his way of trying to make amends for the life he'd been living." "Tell him I'm grateful," Cheryl replied, bouncing Elizabeth on her knee as the baby gurgled happily at the sheriff. "Tell him that his choice to turn away from Raymond in that moment made all the difference. It gave me the chance to build the life I have now." As winter approached once again, Cheryl found herself thinking about the letter she had written but never sent, the words of gratitude and hope she had penned in the aftermath of Raymond's death. She retrieved it from her drawer one evening, reading her own words with the perspective that a year of healing had brought. "What's that?" Alexander asked, settling beside her with his own cup of coffee. "Something I wrote last year, when I was trying to make sense of everything that had happened. A letter to you that I never sent. May I read it?" She handed him the pages, watching his face as he absorbed the words she had written in the early days of her recovery. When he finished, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," he said simply, "for trusting me with your heart, for letting me be part of your healing, for giving me the family I never dared hope I might have." "Thank you for seeing me," she replied. "Not the broken woman who arrived here, but the person I could become with love and patience and time." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the fire dance in the hearth, while Elizabeth slept peacefully in her cradle nearby. Outside, the wind carried the promise of snow, but inside their home, warmth and love created a sanctuary that no storm could touch. As the second winter of their marriage settled over the ranch, Cheryl found herself pregnant again, this time with a child conceived in love rather than violence. The difference in how she carried this pregnancy was remarkable even to her. Where Elizabeth's gestation had been marked by fear and uncertainty, this new life grew within her, surrounded by joy and anticipation. Another daughter, Dr. Pierce announced, when the baby arrived on a warm June morning, and just as healthy and strong as her sister. They named her Grace for the unmerited favor that had brought them together and sustained them through the darkest chapters of their story. Elizabeth, now walking and chattering in the mysterious language of toddlers, seemed delighted with her new sister, patting the baby's head with gentle curiosity and declaring her pretty in her limited vocabulary. The years that followed brought the kind of happiness that Cheryl had once thought was reserved for other people, people whose lives hadn't been marked by violence and shame. Alexander's ranch prospered, their family grew to include two more children, and Cedar Ridge evolved from a rough frontier town into a proper community with schools and churches and all the amenities of civilization. Edward Reyes eventually married Betty Hill, their wedding a joyous celebration that brought the entire territory together. Ryan Reyes was released from prison after serving 3 years of his sentence and returned to Cedar Ridge, where he worked as his brother's deputy and slowly rebuilt his reputation through honest service and genuine remorse for his past mistakes. Redemption is possible for anyone willing to do the work, Edward said during one of their regular Sunday dinners, watching his brother play with the Moore children in the yard outside. Ryan's proof of that, and so are you, Cheryl. You both took the worst things that happened to you and found ways to transform them into something better. As Elizabeth grew old enough to ask questions about her parentage, Cheryl found herself able to speak honestly about the circumstances of her conception without the shame that had once consumed her. Your first father was not a good man, she explained to her curious daughter, but your real father, the one who chose to love you before you were even born, is the best man I know. Papa Alexander? Elizabeth asked, and Cheryl's heart swelled with gratitude for the simple acceptance in her daughter's voice. Papa Alexander, she confirmed, the man who saw us both when we needed him most and decided we were worth loving. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the house was peaceful, Cheryl would sometimes take out the letter she had written so many years ago and read it again, marveling at how far she had traveled from the broken woman who had penned those words. The fears that had once dominated her life seemed like echoes from someone else's story, distant and powerless to touch the joy she had found. Do you ever regret it? Alexander asked one such evening, following her thoughts as he so often did. Coming here, marrying me, building this life we have? Never, she replied without hesitation. Not for a single moment. Even knowing what we had to go through to get here, I would make the same choices again. Even the pain? Even the fear? Even those, she said, reaching for his hand across the small table where they sat. Because they led me to you, to our children, to this home we've built together. I wouldn't trade any of it, not even the darkest parts, because they're all threads in the same tapestry. As the years passed and their children grew into young adults with dreams and ambitions of their own, Cheryl found herself becoming something she had never expected, a source of strength and wisdom for other women facing their own trials. Word of her story had spread throughout the territory, and she often received visits from women who had heard that there was someone in Cedar Ridge who understood what it meant to survive the unthinkable. The hardest part, she would tell them, is believing that you deserve better than what was done to you. But you do deserve better, and with time and patience and the right people around you, you can build a life that's not just about surviving, but about thriving. Some of the women who sought her counsel were fleeing abusive husbands. Others had been assaulted or abandoned, and still others were simply lost and looking for direction. To each of them, Cheryl offered the same message, that their past did not define their future, that healing was possible, and that there were people in the world willing to stand with them as they fought for something better. Martha Robinson, now well into her 70s but still sharp as a tack, often assisted with these informal counseling sessions, her practical wisdom and no-nonsense approach providing a perfect complement to Cheryl's gentle empathy. You've become quite the advocate, Martha observed one afternoon after helping a young widow decide whether to return to her family in the East or stay in Montana to homestead on her own. That girl Raymond James thought he was destroying has turned into quite a force for good in this world. I had good teachers, Cheryl replied, thinking of all the people who had shaped her journey from victim to survivor to advocate. You, Alexander, Edward, even Ryan in his way, all of you showed me that people can change, that circumstances don't have to be permanent, that there's always hope for something better if you're willing to fight for it. As her 50th birthday approached, Cheryl found herself looking back over the decades of her life with a sense of wonder at the journey she had traveled. The terrified young woman who had fled Chicago with nothing but the clothes on her back and a secret growing in her womb seemed like a character from someone else's story. So complete had been her transformation. Elizabeth, now married with children of her own, had become a teacher in the Cedar Ridge School, passing on to the next generation the values of compassion and resilience that had shaped her own upbringing. Grace had followed in her adoptive father's footsteps, taking over much of the ranch management and proving herself as capable as any man at the work of raising cattle and managing land. I'm proud of the women you've both become, Cheryl told her daughters during a family gathering to celebrate Alexander's 60th birthday. You've taken the love and security we tried to give you and used it to build your own strong foundations. We learn from the best, Elizabeth replied, raising her glass in a toast to her parents. You showed us that strength isn't about never falling down, but about getting back up every time life knocks you over. As the evening wound down and the extended family began to disperse to their own homes, Cheryl and Alexander found themselves alone on the porch where they had shared so many significant moments over the years. The ranch stretched out before them in the moonlight, peaceful and prosperous, a testament to what could be built with patience and love and unwavering commitment to each other. Any regrets? Alexander asked, echoing the question he had posed so many years ago on their wedding night. Only that we can't live it all over again, Cheryl replied, leaning into the warmth of his embrace. It's been a good life, Alexander. Better than I ever dared dream when I was running scared across the country with nowhere to go. It's not over yet, he reminded her. We've got grandchildren to spoil and great-grandchildren to look forward to. There are still adventures ahead of us. As they sat together watching the stars wheel overhead in their eternal patterns, Cheryl thought about the letter she had written so long ago, the words of gratitude and hope that had marked the beginning of her healing. She had kept that letter all these years, not as a reminder of pain overcome, but as a testament to the power of human kindness to transform even the darkest circumstances into something beautiful. Tomorrow she would take out paper and pen once more, not to write words of desperate gratitude, but to record the wisdom that half a century of living had taught her. She would write for the women who would come after her, the ones who would face their own Raymond Jameses, and need to know that survival was possible, that healing was real, that love could bloom even in the harshest soil if it was tended with patience and care. Dear friend, she would begin, addressing the unknown women who might one day need to hear her story. If you are reading this, then you are probably where I once was, afraid, alone, convinced that your life is ruined beyond repair. I want you to know that you are wrong about that last part. Nothing is ever ruined beyond repair if you have the courage to begin again. The wind whispered across the prairie, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of rain, and Cheryl smiled as she thought about the words she would write. Her story had begun with a desperate flight from violence and shame, but it had become something far greater, a testament to the power of community, the possibility of redemption, and the transformative force of love that sees beyond surface wounds to the strength that lies beneath. She had been a mail-order bride who arrived pregnant by another man, carrying secrets that threatened to destroy any chance of happiness. But she had found a sheriff who read between the lines of her carefully constructed facade, a man who saw her need and chose to protect rather than exploit it, a community that rallied around justice rather than judgment. Most importantly, she had found herself, not the broken victim she had believed herself to be, but a woman capable of extraordinary courage, devastating honesty, and transformative love. The child conceived in violence had become a source of joy. The marriage born of desperation had become a partnership of equals, and the flight from shame had become a journey toward dignity and purpose. As the moon set and dawn approached, painting the eastern sky in shades of gold and rose, Cheryl Anderson Moore closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of gratitude for the long, strange journey that had brought her home. She had learned that home was not always the place you were born, that family was not always blood, and that love was not always convenient or easy or safe. But she had also learned that love was always worth the risk, always worth the fight, always worth the patience required to tend it through seasons of drought and plenty alike. And that knowledge, hard-won through years of struggle and joy, was perhaps the greatest gift she could offer to the women who would come after her, searching for their own paths from darkness into light. The sun rose over the Montana prairie, painting the world in shades of hope and possibility, and Cheryl Anderson Moore smiled as she watched it climb toward the endless sky. She had found her place in the world at last, and it was exactly where she belonged.